push-ups. But anyway, if you guys have not met me, there's only a few of you. But I am Heather Denny. I'm currently deployed. So even if the COVID stuff weren't happening, you wouldn't be seeing me right now. But today we're going to go over non-boldface, boldface procedures. And I do want to let you all know this is definitely not an all-encompassing list of things that you need to know to stay safe throughout emergencies, that sort of thing, or that you might need to know right off the bat. I tried to make the list comprise of things that I think we either don't talk about enough in our community or things that we don't practice on a regular basis. So I left things like 1 or 2 engine failure off the list, since we practice those at least once, if not a ton in the sim, that sort of thing. I will be attempting to use the raise hand function today, so try not to click that button unless you are trying to be called on. And if I cut out at any minute, just let me know. Feel free to ask questions as we go along, since all of these are going to be different emergencies. Figure out how to click. There we go. So these are the things we're going to go over. Obviously, it's a super long list. I know we're starting this meeting late. If you have to leave when the normal hour would have been up, feel free. It's totally fine. But if you can stick around, please do, because I anticipate this to take roughly the full hour. As you can see on the right-hand side, I've got the medal listed there. Fates, don't throw spears if it's wrong. Today, we're going to mainly go over the maintain aircraft control portion of this. And so just going over the overarching goals of each of these emergencies and how to stop the immediate threat. All right, so just as a warm-up, since we're going to be talking about non-boldface boldface, I felt like it was wrong to not talk about actual boldface. So can someone raise their hand to give us the engine fire on the ground boldface? You don't have to sit at attention, anything like that. Just want to know what the steps are and who accomplishes them. And if I don't see hand raised, I'm just going to call on someone. So. All right. Let's do Tyler Weaver, brand new.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, you're saving him.
Okay, yeah, I will save him. Okay, so this will be a fire handle pulled by the pilot and agent discharged by the pilot.
Perfect. Good job, Lily. That's perfect. We're not going to go over anything further. We're just reviewing our boldface. All right, next up, emergency engine shutdown can include when we perform this. If you don't know how to do the raise your hand function, it's in the participants window.
I'll go ahead and do this one since you kind of already called on me. It's
Perfect.
Tyler again. So emergency engine shutdown, so you go throttle idle by the pilot flying, fire handle pulled by the pilot monitoring, and agent as required by the pilot monitoring. And you do those when you have a engine fire, engine disintegration, I think it is, and then visible fluids on the wing or pylon that can't be stopped.
Yep, coming from the engine or pylon, that can't be stopped.
Okay.
But other than that, it was absolutely perfect. Good job. All right, and this one, we'll go with Zach Vaughn, because I know he so wants to do this one, for smoke and fumes in the airplane.
Thank you, Heather.
You're so welcome.
For smoke and fumes in the airplane, it's oxygen on 100%, co-pilot, pilot, engineer.
Perfect. And then what other means is the exact same?
Loss of pressurization.
You got it. Perfect. Nice quick review. Now we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it all. I'm about to show a picture of a C5 after a mishap, so if you think that'll freak you out, I guess look away from your screen. Here we go. So this is a picture. I found it on the internet, so I'm sure safety guys have a lot more information. than I gathered from that. But this was a picture after a C5 crashed in Ramstein. They had a thrust reverser deploy during their takeoff climb. Their speed was rolling back. They felt a buffet, and then they stalled at about 100 feet above the ground. About half the crew died. And so I just wanted to show this picture, not to freak anybody out, but to convey the seriousness of us knowing these procedures, especially ones like these for thrust reversers deploying uncommanded, that sort of thing, that have come about because of mishaps. And other ones that are there to prevent something disastrous such as this. Moving on from the picture, you can look if you looked away. TR deploy, we have a lot safer thrust reversers, in my opinion, now than when that mishap occurred. Now we have pneumatic thrust reversers, but they still do have a chance of deploying uncommanded. So we've got a multitude of different CWAs that are related to the thrust reversers, but these are the two that have to do with a possible uncommanded deployment. So TR deploy and TR not stowed. In addition to this, you should theoretically be seeing on your engine display our typical, in transit and then the green for deployed. So I think Dallin Gray's in here. I'm going to call him out since we talked about this recently. Not stating any like procedure or anything, but overarching, if you have a thrust reverser, deploy while you're flying, either takeoff, at cruise, anything like that, what is your overarching goal in this scenario?
To not have it deployed.
That is very true. But I mean, is it bad if it's deployed but it's not spitting out thrust?
So if it's deployed and you have the power up, we said it was like 60% of your thrust, but it's backwards. So if you do the math on that, you're almost down to 2 engines if you have that throttle, if you have that thrust reverser all the way up at full power, because you're gonna have to use another engine to compensate for the reverse thrust, and at that point you have 2 engines plus another engine with 40%. So you're kind of in a bad state. The Dash 1 talks about how the fire handle, basically the fire handle will shut that engine off completely. But also for the TRs, you're not gonna be able to stow it, but also that TR is not gonna be able to produce reverse thrust. So that's like I said, it's just I think it's a caution or a warning in the Dash 1. But so those are I don't know, what other considerations are you thinking about that you're
Yeah, no, that is perfect. You went deeper than I even wanted to do. That was absolutely great. So yeah, just like you said, like it's spitting out potentially up to 60% of that forward thrust as now reverse thrust. So we want to get rid of the thrust. That's our main goal in maintaining aircraft control with this emergency. So with that, here are the steps that are listed. Obviously, it's in our Dash 1 and emergency procedures, but for your immediate action is going to be throttle to idle to get rid of that thrust. The steps have a note about waiting 15 seconds after you bring the throttle to idle before you pull that fire handle. And that's just to allow the EEC to auto stow the thrust reverser. So if for some reason you're still, like losing speed or, your wings dropping, something like that, I mean, my opinion, but I would still pull that fire handle, because if you can't stow the thrust reverser, it's not necessarily hurting you, just hurting your range. But if you are able to control the jet, wait the 15 seconds, let it try to auto stow, then pull that fire handle. After that, you're going to do your precautionary engine shutdown. And then if it's on engines number 2 and 3, those are the only ones that have the emergency retract switches, which we also have a different checklist for if the engines are running. And that's to be used, if we are using our TRs to increase our descent rate. That's something like that. And then we're within our speed windows and the TRs don't retract from there. But this is a separate checklist. Any questions on that one? Also, as I go through, if IPs or EPs have any spears to throw, anything like that, let me know. And also, I do not have the chat pulled up. So if anyone has questions in there, someone please speak up. All right, moving on, flap slat general procedures. This is another thing that could absolutely cause an extreme mishap in the C5. So I'm looking for an FP to give us when you would accomplish these general procedures and roughly what those 4 steps are. All right, let's see. Keenan Duncan, because I love you so much, I'm gonna call on you.
Hey, good morning. So for the flaps and slats, so you would run the general procedures for really anytime you have a malfunction with either of the two. So the first step would be to turn off the autopilot. And then if you did have a commanded rolling moment, like moving the flap handle, then you immediately want to move it back, which I feel like you would do that before you called for this checklist. But and then if there is no rolling movement and you just have the situation, then you would put the flap handle to the corresponding flap position. So that way if it does start moving, it's going to stay where it's at. And then you would scan the affected system.
You're muted, Heather.
Thank you. I have 2 things to point out. First being, just like Keenan said, anytime that we have a flap or slat malfunction, we should be running these procedures first. So as dumb as it is, if we get those slats in transit, that is a slat malfunction. So we should be running these general procedures. So even if we are super proficient, we get this every time, you've got it 5 times on the same mission, something like that, I still encourage you, we should be running this. And even if we know the procedures and we know that none of this really applies, for habit patterns, I encourage everyone to still run this. Because the next time that you have a flap issue, you might forget that the general procedures are even something that we should be doing. And then the second part, I was talking to Adam Smith. He said that pretty much all of the evaluators do this. I try to do this. I forget every once in a while, so I'm trying to get better at it. But for every person, anytime that we move that flap handle, these procedures are why it's a great idea to leave your hand on or near that flap handle in case you do encounter a rolling moment. Because then you're already there ready to reverse it. And then one other thing I wanted to point out is this right here. So it says 0, 40, 100, moving it back to whatever position you had it in previously. I did have this in the sim one time where they gave it to us, and we moved the flaps to 100, got the rolling moment, moves them back to 40, and then we got a rolling moment in the opposite direction. So then we, after that, had to move it, to an intermediate position. So just know that you can move it again if you have an opposite effect, but start with moving it back to the previous position. Thanks, Keenan.
Hey, Heather, can I jump in here for a second?
Yeah, hop in.
So I think one thing that's important to point out about this procedure, and this happens pretty frequently, I think if you've flown the C5 for any period of time, the slat malfunction, either your slats have gone in transit or you've had a flat break fire or something like that. It's pretty common It's pretty common malfunction, you could call it. Sometimes it's pretty simple and other times it's not. A trend that we've seen happen pretty recently is an over-reliance on the engineer to run this procedure. Now, what I'm not advocating for is to disregard a checklist or to let your student engineer talk you through or not follow the steps or not learn or anything like that. But we've had several instances in the past year or two where we've gotten this slat malfunction where the slats wouldn't come up, wouldn't show retracted at like a max gross weight, right? So when that happens, your VMFR is 209 typically, and then obviously your flap retract speed or your flat retract speed is 215. So to hang out in that 6-knot window for an extended period of time, which we've had some crews do, it's just not a safe position to be. And most of the time it's been, hey, there's a student engineer at the panel, they're trying to run this procedure, but this is where understanding what you're trying to do comes into play. You can be directive to be like, hey, engineer, like I have no rolling moment, my autopilot's off. We need to get the flaps back to the previous, we need to get the flaps 40 so I can safely maneuver the airplane. That goes back to what Heather's saying about maintaining aircraft control. So we've had crews that have oversped in that scenario. We've had crews that have let themselves fly in that configuration for extended periods of time. You're much closer to a fall if there's something else going on. So this is a really important procedure, something you'll see common to make sure that you as pilots, or we as pilots, we drive the malfunction. Like, yes, the engineer reads the checklist, but an over-reliance on them, especially in a flap-slat malfunction, like you don't have time to wait for the rolling movement to be felt, right? We don't have time, so this is a great discussion point.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, there we go. And that goes for most of these malfunctions and procedures that we're talking about today. Most of them, I'm not saying to not use the checklist. Absolutely, we always will go back and use the checklist. But for all these procedures, in some extreme scenarios, they will have to be done immediately before you have time to call for the checklist, just like Keaton had mentioned. All right, uncommanded flight control inputs. So this could be experienced maybe at cruise, your plane just starts banking and you're not in a country where you're gonna get spoofed or anything like that. Something where you are not touching the controls and the airplane starts doing its own thing. Now I do want to point out that this can be confused with the two previous, hopefully with a thrust reverser deploy scenario, you're going to see a CWA or see your engine controls make a change or even hear the thrust reversers. Another thing for the flaps slats, those are going to happen while you're moving the flaps and slats most likely. So this one is mostly, most often going to be, at cruise, something like that, but it obviously could happen on an approach or takeoff, something like that as well. So the overarching goal for this one, maintaining aircraft control, is to be cutting off that stability augmentation system and the autopilot from the flight controls. There are different scenarios where these, if they have multiple issues overlapping, that they can not automatically kick off the system. So why we have these procedures. And it's hard to describe it, so I'll just give you guys the answer for this one. We're going to move the AUG and ASCS switches to off. And you're going to do that immediately. And one thing to note is that it is not necessarily going to hurt you by doing this. Worst case, you turn it back on, like you did it, and it was something totally different, like a wind shear or something like that. You turn it off, okay, now you just turn it back on, and you're fine. Best case, you saved everyone's lives. All right, so this one's going to be the only anyone that stands a couple different slides, lovely 4-engine flame out. Who can tell me what our overarching goals for this scenario would be? Feel free to just chime in because I don't think people are comfortable with the raised hand.
Hey Heather, it's Alex. The overarching goal here, I mean, a lot of this depends on where you are in space and what you were doing when this happened, right? So the biggest number one thing is, not stalling the airplane and eventually getting some of the engines back so that you can keep the airplane in control and get it to land as soon as possible. Um, Obviously, I'm sure you're going to talk about, everything you need to do to get those engines started, but your main thinking is I need to keep the plane at least above 155, so I've got flight controls, making sure that RAT gets deployed. And then depending on where you are, like altitude, if there are mountains in the area, like where your obstacles are, making sure that you're pointing the airplane as close to an airfield as possible, and keeping the crew kind of not calm, but just like making sure everyone's like, all right, let's get these engines started. Let's get this plane on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. He said it perfectly. We want to make sure that we can control the airplane. So he mentioned flight controls, and then also getting an engine back. And then also being aware of your surroundings, that sort of thing, like he had mentioned. So to do that, we're going to go through the different steps. I'll talk about one of the steps that is not on here, but number one is regaining control of the airplane. Hopefully everyone knows our RAT should deploy automatically if we have it in auto, because 3 adjacent or 2 inboard, 1 outboard engines have fallen below N2 idle. But in case it hasn't, the number one step is to bring the RAT switch to deploy. And we do that whether or not it has auto deployed, just to make sure that it's out there and it stays there until we have engines available. The second step is one that I didn't put up there because I think it's intuitive. It's just bringing your left MFDU to engines, which I think you would be reminded of by the time you get down to your air start. You're going to bring your throttles to idle. That's just to help with the starting of the engines and to not damage the engines. And then speed. So speed, they want us to fly 250 knots calibrated. So this is something where I was like, okay, where does this 250 come from? Maybe it's best flag sort of thing. It's also part of our drift down speed. And again, any instructors or evaluators can chime in, but the thing that I came up with that makes the most sense to me, why they chose 250 and did not include the Mach, was because it is a calibrated airspeed. So for our drift down, it's 250.60, whichever is less. And let's say we're flying at flight level 380, our 0.6 Mach is going to correspond to a speed, a knots calibrated speed that's less than the 190 required for our RAT to work above 15,000 feet. So I think that's where the 250 comes in to play the most, and then potentially also helping out our N2 limits, which we'll talk about when we get to air starts. If anyone has anything else to add to that, please let me know.
Yeah, and Heather, I misspoke. Stu was kind enough to put the answer in the chat, but 155 is for flight instruments, so that's my bad. I misspoke on that.
All good. And I guess we can just review the speeds as well. So 190 above 15,000 feet, 175 below 15,000 feet. Those are for your flight controls, and like you said, 155 for your flight instruments. And then we move on to our air starts. We're going to start with a starter assisted on engine number 3, and then our windmilling air starts for the rest of the engines, engines 1, 2, and 4. This is another question that kind of just perplexed me. Like, why do we start number 3 first? And the best thing that I could think of, and makes the most sense to me, is that adding system number 3 hydraulics gives us back the most amount of our flight controls possible. Since with 2, we already have a little bit of every system, number 3 is going to give us the most back. So this gives our favorable parameters. We'll see how you guys did on your worksheets. But if you take anything away from this slide, I want it to be that you can only attempt a starter-assisted start on one engine at a time. If you do it on more than one, you might be screwing your chance of getting an engine start on either of those 2 engines, or any of them that you're doing. With your altitudes, you're going to be trying to start all the way down, right? So you're only going to be getting lower, so you're going to get to a favorable altitude at some point. And then your N2, I did have this conversation with a couple people trying to see, at 250 knots calibrated, that sort of thing, where could we expect our N2 to be? I don't know. Drew Pagoff brought up a great point that, the higher you are, the less air there is. So your N2 is probably going to be lower. And then the lower you get, your N2 is probably going to be higher. And you can see that you have a minimum N2 requirement for unassisted starts and a lower altitude, and then a lower N2 requirement with a higher altitude for the starter assisted. So. And then the last part of this 4-engine flameout situation, and correct me if I'm wrong because it was not in specific charts, but this is happening when you're oceanic. You're now in 7 bus ops, right? Because you don't have any AC power, you don't have any of your generators running. However, your HF radios are run off of the aircraft battery as one of their 3 primary sources. So I believe you should still have your HF radios and should still be able to talk to ATC as your number 1 as you're starting your bid to the right, since you can't maintain altitude. All right, that was a lot. Does anyone have any questions about 4-engine flameout and engine starts, anything like that?
So I've talked to some of the DCMA guys who are the ones who FCF the C5s when they come out of their depot or when they were coming out of B models to M models and all that sort of stuff. And just like you said, Heather, the airplane likes to restart its engines and the APUs for that matter at lower altitude. So the Dash 1 obviously talks about 30,000 feet, 20,000 feet. It says the APU can start up to 30,000 feet, and I've been told by multiple people that that APU usually doesn't start until at least under 20,000 feet. So in a 4-engine flameout scenario, if you were ever to get into one, the one piece of advice that was given to me, especially about the APU, was stop, start, run, just keep resetting that thing and letting it go, and then just expect that you're going to be at a lower altitude potentially before things could happen. Which, I can only imagine you're going to continue to panic if, heaven forbid, you're ever in this scenario. So try your best to stay calm, and I'm sure many of you have seen the C-17 4-engine flameout and how lucky they got. They didn't accomplish a single checklist and still managed to get the engine started, but yeah, just knowing that the lower you are, it's going to take some time, especially if it happens higher up at altitude.
Absolutely. And shoot, I forget. Oh yeah, and the EEC is going to be trying to do that auto restart. So, you might get lucky like the C-17s, but it's obviously way better if we could have the foreknowledge to take control of each situation. All right, overarching goal of the runaway pitch trim. Who's got it, and how do you combat it?
Heather, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, so for the runaway pitch trim scenario, you immediately want to disconnect use the trim disconnect button, and that's going to be on the inside of each yoke towards the throttles. You'll depress that button. Both pilots should. If one doesn't work, attempt the other one to see if it works as well. If neither of them do disconnect the trim, you can use the manual pitch trim handle to correct that, whichever direction that is automatically trimming by itself. And you can also use bank to control your decayed airspeed in the case of a upward runway pitch trim.
Very nice, Jesse. Thank you. I've got literally nothing else to tell you guys. You did great. All right, FSS fire. This is a two-part. Obviously, this could happen in flight or on the ground, and the way we react is different. So in flight, how much nitrogen do we have? That's the question we should know before we ever take off. I think usually, you know, the AC will look at that in the forms, but I think do a better job about letting the whole crew know about, you know, hey, this is how much nitrogen we have today, just so everyone is aware. So how much is required for one firefighting capability? So deep discharge in the largest area. Go ahead, Kim.
250.
Yep, you got that. 250 pounds is required for one of the largest areas. So if you have less than 250, that's where I would say you should absolutely be letting the crew know. Because in that scenario, if you get an FSS fire and you have less than that, you might not be able to put out a fire. So these are unmanned areas as well. So the best you could do is maybe have people around to stop where it's spreading to, but really your last resort is landing as soon as possible. So very vital to know, not waste any of your time and not knowing how much nitrogen you have available. And then on the ground, this is something that I don't think I've ever talked about in my time in the C5, which I think it's something that definitely is helpful for us to talk about. So this comes from the airplane fire checklist. So if you are sitting up on the flight deck and all the loads are doing an unload, all the other pilots are sleeping, your FE went back to troop to take a nap, anything else? What would you do? There are pictures here. So actually I'll just go through it. So if nobody's up there, in the airplane fire checklist, it says any crew member shall accomplish these procedures. So if you have a fire burning in your plane, you don't want to just be like waiting, trying to log into unlock your iPad and find the appropriate checklist. So that's why I think it's important we should talk about this. So the first step is to flip up this red guarded switch and move the switch to arm. I've never actually done this and I haven't actually seen it. I might try it in the sim sometime. I believe the arm to light up once it's armed. And then you go to this panel. These are both on the FE overhead panel. Whichever section is lit up is now the one that you'll press. So let's say left PTU, okay, you armed it, armed is lit up. Now you'll press on left PTU and you should get a discharge light for the entire discharge sequence. If 45 seconds, 60 seconds has passed, you still have this light on, but discharge has gone out. That means the fire is still burning, so you can press it one more time and discharge again until hopefully your FE has finished his nap and come up to the flight deck. Any questions on FSS issues?
If no one's got questions, I got something to add for this.
Yeah, go for it.
So a couple years ago, there was a reserve crew that took the Scumbird and they had to divert into Oklahoma City. They landed, they were doing the post-flight, and the flight engineer shined his flashlight into the sensors, set off the zone alarm push button, and the co-pilot standing next to the panel immediately depressed the system, discharging nitrogen, and the whole crew went to NIF immediately. So before you find yourself in that situation, just triple check there's an actual fire. I mean, the scenario of no one being at the panel and the APU's on, and you're the only one standing there probably is not very likely, but you just want to verify that there's an actual fire, or else you could do some serious health damage to your crew members.
Absolutely. And I did not mention the Scumbird scenarios because that is another scenario. It's just even less likely since we only have 2 of those. I didn't add it in here, but those especially because those are manned areas, right? So if you discharge one of those and you have folks down there, you could do severe damage to them. So absolutely. Thanks, Nick.
Hey, Heather, this is Adam. Just to clarify, Nick, the Scumber doesn't use nitrogen in the manned areas. It uses the FE1301. It's in the cylinders, not even cylinders, they're big silver spheres. I think they shot that into the cargo compartment, if I'm not mistaken, which would be on panel C, which on every other airplane except for our 2 Scumbirds and 3285 don't work. The system is not on the B models. It's only the A models that have that system. And now that Scumbird, I believe, at least last time I flew it, had 2 2-gallon fire extinguishers cargo strapped to the floor, basically noting that the FE1301 wasn't refilled, and therefore that's their new mitigation, is to use the same firefighting equipment as we have in the B model, which is just 2 extra big fire extinguishers in the cargo box.
Sweet. Thanks for the added intel.
Yeah, for real. All right, brake system failure. I think this is important because I know of at least one. I think we've had 2 instances where folks have been pulled into parking. None of their brakes work. So what's our maintain aircraft control? Stop the airplane. Yeah. So how do we do this? Obviously, we have backup upon backup to our brake system. First, try your normal brakes, obviously. If those aren't working, you switch to your alternate. You try those, still doesn't work. Now we switch to our emergency brakes, which should be filled from the accumulator. So theoretically, we should never lose this pressure, right? Well, it's happened in the last few years alone. So what they had done in the past, they were smart enough to use their thrust reversers to stop themselves enough that someone could put in chocks and they could shut down the engines. Does anyone, I don't know if anyone was on the jet with Major Alexander or when he had that scenario, or has anything they can add to what happened in the real life scenario.
Heather, I'll jump in here again since I've done this, unfortunately. I had it after Don. So Don had it in Yokota, I think, holding short of the runway. I did it on one of the Scumbirds, holding short of the runway here at Travis in like a torrential downpour, waiting for the winds to come into limits. And I'll tell you what I did on Monday morning quarterbacking, because I would do it differently if I ever had it happen again. So holding short of the runway, we're lightweight, just going down to Vandenberg. Engineer says, "Hey, you're losing system 4." So I look over the co-pilot and I ask for alternate brakes. They flip alternate brakes. He goes, "Nope, system 1's dumping too." And so my immediate instinct was, having heard Don, I was stopped at the time. The airplane started to creep forward after 4 was bleeding down. We hit 1. I was already stopping on the brakes, holding them. As soon as he hit with system 1 pressure, the airplane violently came to a stop. We were only rolling maybe 1 mile an hour, if that much, as system 4 depleted. And so we're dumping system 1. And so I went and just said, I'm shutting the motors down. I shut down 1, 2, 3, and 4 in rapid succession. and then flipped to emergency brakes as the emergency brake accumulator began to bleed down and stopped somewhere around like 900 psi, if I remember right. The idle power on a lightweight airplane was enough with no brakes to keep us, just to allow us to roll forward, holding short of Travis. If I would do it again, I think I would have shut down 1, 2, and 4. Or 1, 2, and 3, just to leave one engine. The reason I say 1, 2, and 4 is because I want that maybe having that inboard engine with less asymmetric thrust. But that would have left me the opportunity to have one thrust reverser available to me in the case that my emergency brake also dumped all of its pressure, and now I'm rolling forward again. So luckily, shut down 1, 2, 3, and 4 all together sequentially. Put to emergency accumulator started to deplete pressure. But as it was depleting pressure, the airplane had no more forward thrust and stopped moving. And then we were able to put a chalk in, chalk the airplane, went off their normal kind of shutdown stuff after that. But I think I would have left one engine running if I could do it again, just so I would have had a reverse thrust option should I needed to put that TR in. Because what Don ended up doing is he left all 4 motors running and ended up popping 2 and 3 into reverse idle, and then actually going max reverse on the inboards to get the airplane to stop moving forward before they rolled onto the runway at Yokota, as they had no brakes, and then used balanced thrust reversers to keep the airplane in still while the engineer could run down there and chalk the aircraft.
Thank you for sharing that experience, because it's like awesome to hear it from someone that it happened to. I like your Monday morning quarterback, because that's not in any checklist, losing all of your brakes, including emergency, right? So having that out in case you needed a one thrust reverser, I think is a great idea.
If anyone's curious, I'm happy to send the pictures out in Pilot CT if I can dig it out of my phone. But there is a spot, it's about a 3-inch section of brake line that comes out of the anti-skid control box before it goes through the hydraulic fuses. And if that 3-inch section of brake line blows, no matter what system you put to the brake system, you'll just dump the cargo or dump the hydraulic fluid through that hole. And so we sheared that piece of pipe or that brake line, and I effectively dumped 2 hydraulic systems on the ramp here at Travis, and it looked like a bloody mess in the rain with a river of red just pouring out the back of the airplane as those hydraulic systems were completely depleted. On the plus side, maintenance had the airplane FMC refilled and tested within 24 hours, and we blasted off the next day.
That's impressive.
And real quick, this is Joey. Just one more thing, food for thought, is it doesn't have to be a brake failure. We were pulling into chocks at Ramstein, and they had given us the X to stop moving. The marshal had given us the crossed wands to stop moving. And I was in the left seat, got on the brakes, they weren't working, had the co-pilot immediately go to alternate, still not working, emergency, still not working, and pulled out the thrust reversers and immediately stopped it. What it ended up being was we were on just a really thin sheet of ice, so there was just no traction whatsoever to allow us to stop. So there's other situations, not even just a simple brake system failure, that could lead you down this road, having to use the thrust reversers.
It's good to know. I've never heard that before. All right, I'm gonna shoot this one out to the crowd. So you're the pilot monitoring in the right seat for takeoff. At 70 knots, you see the red det failed light come on. You don't hear any tones, anything like that. It's your det fail light that you see lit up. What are you gonna do? You don't have to go through your manual or anything like that. Just, are you gonna take it? What are you gonna do if you do, if you don't? Let's do depledge. Jake.
Hey, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Cool. I think I will probably take it because I know there's an issue with my brakes, obviously. Does DET stand for detection? Is that what that is? I was
Detector. Yep.
Detector. Okay, detector fail. Yeah, so I'd probably take it and then leave the gear hanging because I know there's some switches. If I think the light goes out when you take off because you have to have the weight on wheels switch. Is that right? To get the
Yeah.
light as well.
Okay, and then are you thinking about anything else as you coordinate to come back around because obviously you have an issue, or are you doing anything different with your normal flying habit patterns?
Yeah, so like I said, I don't retract the gear unless basically a greater emergency exists. And then
Yeah, that's perfect. Sorry, I totally missed it the first time.
no, it's all good. And then checking EDS probably with the engineer, seeing if there's, having the scanner go down, see if there's anything visibly wrong with any of the main landing gear, see if he can see any issues with the brakes.
Cool.
Um,
That's perfect.
and then once you're in, doing like a quick stop checklist probably.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if you have this and you do take it, you're going to run the actual procedure. But just like he said, huge thing here is to not bring the gear up, because if you have a det failed light, that means that you could potentially have some locked brakes during takeoff, which if you bring the gear up, that means that you are now isolating all that heat, and you could have a fuselage fire, which is one of the very few mishaps that have happened in the C5, was a fuselage fire after a det failed from locked brakes during takeoff. I don't know if in that scenario they did bring the gear up or not, but by leaving it hanging, you are helping yourself by trying to prevent that from happening. And then a note about the speed. Really, he could have gone either way. I agree. I would also take it, I think, at 70 knots. The Dash 1 just says it does not recommend stopping at relatively high speeds. So what is a relatively high speed? You could call that 80 knots or above, but in this scenario, I think I would go with 70, depending on all the conditions, of course. All right, second scenario for somebody to take. Pilot monitoring, right seat for takeoff, 70 knots, you see bogey pitch, and you hear an unaccompanied tone. Who wants to take it? Should say,
Hey,
oh. Go ahead. Who was it? You could take it.
I can take it, Heather. I was just trying to find the raise hand button, but it was taking me forever. So it was bogey pitch, right? And we're rolling on takeoff. So with that, you were just going to continue the takeoff, but leave the gear hanging. And then the worst thing you could do would be to put the gear up, potentially damage the gear.
Exactly, because with our bogey pitch, thanks to the side braces down and locked, so it does the rotation out of the normal sequence. So exactly, you leave the gear hanging. Both scenarios.
Yeah, this is Ken Sawyers. So I have a quick question for the last slide. For the det fail light that's coming on, when you're coming back around, if you had that, would you have to consider that it's going to take you longer to come to a complete stop on the runway since you might not have anti-skid, or what?
Yeah, so the actual procedure has a ton of different steps. These are just like the initial ones for pilots that are immediate. But exactly, you obviously have something wrong with your anti-skid system. So you might have, you'll be thinking about hot brakes, maybe not having anti-skid, that sort of thing. I'd have to look at the full checklist because I don't remember it exactly. But
Awesome. Thank you.
If
And
anybody has anything.
running that procedure is going to tell you, hopefully tell you what's wrong. So you'll either get some type of indication that you have either locked brakes, or which if you got it on takeoff roll, you'd probably get some semblance of knowing. Or it's going to tell you like you have a set of freewheeling brakes. Typically, is what the det fail is. That the brakes actually aren't engaging appropriately. So ideally, if you have the time to run the procedure, you're going to find out what's actually wrong, and then you'd have the time to be able to kind of troubleshoot and then adjust your landing distance appropriately for what was going on. But the hard part about the det fail light is it comes on. It's really hard to know what's wrong. So the det fail light has come on when a tire has flown off the C5 before. That was the reason for a det fail light. So there's a wide variety of things that can generate a det fail. And so you're not always going to get to know why.
Also, I was going to throw up a question for the group. How do people feel about rejecting for a bogey pitch at 70 knots in the low speed regime?
I was just thinking the same thing. I feel like the bogey pitch, in my opinion, it's not, or it doesn't seem like something that's going to affect our ability to stop or our told numbers to stop on the runway available. We know we'll be well below our refusal speed. And like you said, we're in the low speed regime. It's just at 70 knots, it makes it a little difficult. You kind of have maybe a split second to make that choice. But I believe it is reasonable to reject for a bogey pitch in the low speed regime.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there.
Absolutely. And it totally depends on, your factors that day that might influence you if you're heavyweight, but you're still, low enough that at 70 knots, you're probably not going to have hot brakes more than likely. And depending on your runway length, you may have to, burn down fuel before you can land, something like that. Yeah, you're below the 80 knots, absolutely valid to reject in that scenario.
Hey, it's Flick. I'll throw in just my 2 cents on the thing. The whole reason we had that 80 knots call is to kind of differentiate between that low speed regime and that high speed regime. If you guys are going to brief these things where it's like, hey, I'm going to reject for det fail at 70 knots, or I might reject for a bogey pitch at maybe 65 knots or whatever it is, just make sure that the crew is fully aware of kind of what your intentions are prior to doing that. The whole thing about that 80 knots call is it takes out a lot of the guesswork. When we look at something, we usually know whether it's like a huge systems issue or whether it's something that we can kind of continue with. So everybody's on the same page. So just make sure that that's spelled out with and everybody kind of knows what's going on if your intentions are different than that.
All right, moving on. So DC power failure, this one, put in just because I don't think we talk about it that often, maybe once a year, once every couple years in the Sims anyway. Sorry, there's a lot of words. I didn't know how to put it up here. But essentially, if you have a DC power failure, so more than likely your engineer is going to call out that he has like main DC off power, light illuminated, telling him that, hey, we don't have any DC power right now. So you're sucking the battery dry. So you don't know how long that light may have been on before your engineer noticed it. But no matter what, you're going to move the instrument power switch to emergency. And the faster that you do this, the only reason I bring up this scenario is because you are giving yourself the ability to have full capabilities if you absolutely need it. I say that with caution because, like I said, we have up to, I believe, 30 minutes of battery power. You don't know how long the engineer didn't see that light. And also, you don't know how long the battery will actually last. But if you're somewhere where you're in just a total shitstorm and you're out of emergency fuel and it's really terrible weather, that sort of thing, giving yourself a couple extra minutes instead of waiting to, read through the checklist, whatnot, might give you further capabilities. And last but not least, I think our community has gotten better at talking about this in recent years. However, I didn't know about this for like at least my first year of flying, which is really sad. So that's why I included it, because of my own failure of not knowing how to open the door if an emergency happened. So if you've flown with me, we've probably talked about this. There are 3 easy steps. There is not a picture of this mechanical lock in the Dash 1 that I could find, or in the I forget what it's called, the PowerPoint presentation with all the pictures in it that we have. So I drew it in here, but it's above the door, and you remove that mechanical lock. Then you pull this handle to the right, it's bright yellow. And then you'll push forcefully out on the crew entry door. Important to note, when you're pushing this out, hold on to the handles to the stairway. I don't know if it's true or not, but I have heard that there was once a guy who had to do these procedures and his foot got stuck, and as he pushed out on the door, it took him with with the door, which obviously would not have been a good day for him. And then just be aware that the ladder will be hanging up to 5 feet above the ground. All right. This is just a quick fun fact. If you guys have an engine, thank you, component, engine acting strange, in flight, almost every scenario where you have an engine just acting super weird, anything like that, your first step is going to be pulling the effective throttle to idle. There are important exceptions to this. Engine fan vibe high. If that's caused by icing, obviously you want to be increasing air through that nacelle to get the anti-ice heating up and melting the ice. And then engine manifold temp hot. Again, we want to increase the airflow through there. But for all of these listed, it is the first or second to follow auto throttles disconnected. So it's just a little fun fact. All right. Are there any questions or any other things you guys want to add to, go over, anything like that?
Yeah, this is Blankenberg, if y'all can hear me. I just sent out a picture on the Pilot CT thread for this discussion. They talked big time about emergency equipment and how to operate the door. So I took a picture of that cable that you were mentioning, Heather. So it was so frustrating for us during the pre-flight to talk about that cable. So I ended up taking a picture of it. It's a little hard to see with the brightness, but yeah, it's that cable for both normal and emergency operation. The engineers will pull that cable to disengage that mechanical lock. So hopefully that helps everybody.
Thank you. That's amazing. All right. If no one has anything else, so I'll just leave this up here while people log off. These are just some other things that we didn't cover that I think are very, very important to at least have some knowledge or total knowledge about, like small recovery. You should probably know exactly how to do that. Obviously, again, not all inclusive, but I'll just leave this here.
Sorry, this is, I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead, dude.
Real quick. This is Hafker. Just real quick, since we got all you guys on here, we're doing the in-flight guide rewrite in Tactics right now, so we're all working on it. But if you guys have anything, we're going to try and have a rough draft to send out to everybody by the end of the month. But if there's anything prominent or that you are like, hey, we definitely need to change this, other than obvious things like oceanic contingency procedures have obviously changed since it was written. But if you think there's things that should be added or removed, please get in touch with myself, Dawson, Guanch, or Gray, and let us know, and we can work on getting things added or removed to the in-flight guide. And it won't be printed. It'll just be digital, so we have a little more flexibility on what we can put in. There's not length limits or formatting issues like we had previously.
Sweet. And this is Joey. Just some food for thought, and actually a question for really anybody, or not really a question, but correct me if I'm wrong, but there's nowhere in our checklist that require us to check that the TR levers are actually stowed before starting engines. Is that correct? And it's the same for the engineers. I went through their checklist, and their pre-flight doesn't require them to check that. If I'm wrong, just go ahead and chime in. But I bring this up because we did a local on Wednesday, started engines, and when number one started, the TR started to deploy. Normally, when I'm in the left seat and I'm the one checking or calling out throttles idle during the before starting engine checklist, I will move the throttles through its full range of motion, and that's how I would catch that. But that's not a requirement. So right now, with these jets not flying as much and with maintenance doing limited stuff on limited maintenance on the jets with only one crew working at a time, we found a few switches that were not where they were supposed to be. Like for the first time ever, when I'm checking that my side panel, Copilot side panel, that all the switches weren't safe, I found 3 of the 4 were not. So just be vigilant as you're getting in the airplane and checking that everything's where it's supposed to be, that switches aren't moved before you start cranking engines and whatnot, just because that was the first time that I've ever had the TR levers pulled out before starting engines.
Hey, Joey's a blessing here. I
Yeah.
actually just ran into that exact same scenario on my last trip out of home station. I was in the right seat, and it's exactly as you described it. The TRs themselves, like for everyone's essay, like you won't see, like the first thing I noticed is I saw the like the transit box on the display, and that the TR didn't start deploying until basically the start box went out. So it's kind of delayed there, but
correct.
From
And
when you're looking at throttles, like you would never know, like all 4 were in reverse idle, so like you wouldn't see any real change or anything like that. Like you're not going to notice that difference in throttle angle. Like you physically have to check that, and I don't know that's written anywhere other than just says throttle's idle, which I guess you'd have to interpret then that it's not in reverse ground idle.
Right, but it's not specifically written in there. So, Adam, that's exactly what my plan is. I do plan on doing an ASAP and writing an 847 for it to include move the throttles through full range of motion during the before starting engines check, because that would be the only way right now to catch that scenario. Is it a big deal? No, not really. But why would we not try to prevent that from happening if we could? So, just as a suggestion, technique, whenever you're going through that checklist, go ahead and move that throttle through its full range of motion before you call throttles idle, just to help ourselves catch TR levers that might not be stowed.
Hey, Dave Plessinger, would it be possible one of the ADOs to reach out down to maintenance? Like, I'd be curious about what maintenance procedure they run where they would just leave. They would even be messing with the TRs. Like, I can't imagine a scenario where that would be the case. The 2 instances over the course of like the last 2 weeks seems like a lot, and that seems kind of weird.
Yeah, I can reach out to our maintenance counterparts and see what they have to say.
Well, if anyone doesn't have anything else, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. If you have anything else, feel free to comment on here. I'll stick around for a little while, and then also on Slack if you think of something later. But thank you.